As far as Spencerian school of thought is concerned, as I'm saying that the poets of Spencerian school of thought, they imitated the trends and the ideals of Edmund Spencer. In spite of changing needs of the age, in spite of changing trends of the age, they were following the traditions, they were following the set patterns of Edmund Spencer. That's why they are classified into this school of thought. And the prominent writers of this school of thought are two brothers, in fact, Phineas Fletcher and Giles Fletcher. Keep writing down these names. First, write down Phineas Fletcher, Phineas, Phineas Fletcher, Fletcher. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this name, Phineas. This is what I know, that the name, how it should be pronounced is Phineas. So you may rectify me if I'm wrong in the pronunciation of this particular name. And the other name was Giles Fletcher, Giles Fletcher. And the important work, the chief work of Fletcher is The Purple Island. Actually, these were two brothers and they were priests. And here ends the Spencerian school of thought. The other school of thought was Cavalier poets. Now, who were these Cavalier poets? These were actually the poets who were singing the songs of Charles I. As I have told you people that about half of the population, more than half of the population was against Charles I, and they were raising against him, raising slogans against him. They were protesting against him. And these poets, Cavalier means royalist, the one who writes for the court, for the sake of the court, to make the king happy. So these writers, these poets actually wrote for the sake of Charles I to make him happy. That's why they are called royalist poets or Cavalier poets. As far as their subject matter is concerned, and let me tell you that some of the critics, they don't agree with this statement that they must be branded as Cavalier poets. As far as their subject matter, as I'm saying, is concerned, and as far as their technical abilities are concerned regarding poetry, they must be classified and they must be put into the metaphysical school of thought. They must not be having an other school of thought like Cavalier poets. So, and some of the poets like Lovelace and Suckling from Cavalier poets, they were directly the students of John Donne. And you know that John Donne was the leader of metaphysical poets. So their subject matter is just like the subject matter of metaphysical poets. They are said Cavalier poets only because of one reason, that they were supporting Charles I in that civil war. Now coming toward the last school of thought is metaphysical poetry. What is metaphysical poetry and who are metaphysical poets? Write down a few names. John Donne was actually the leader of metaphysical poets. The names are Crashaw, Crashaw, George Herbert, Lovelace. These were amongst Henry Vaughan, Henry Vaughan. These were actually metaphysical poets. And now first make your concept clear that what is metaphysical poetry. Meta means beyond and physical means this natural world. So the poetry that is beyond this natural world is called metaphysical poetry. How? The poetry that doesn't deal with the body, the poetry that deals with the spirit, the poetry that deals with the soul. Metaphysical poets were highly religious poets. They were highly religious, as well as they were more concerned with the love of God with human beings and the love of human beings with God, rather than physical love or rather than sensual love. They were propagating and they were preaching the sacred love, the love of soul. They were talking about the soul. They were not talking about the body. That's why their poetry is called metaphysical poetry. And what are the chief characteristics of metaphysical poetry? This is replete with imagery, with quibbling imagery, with the metaphors, with the far-fetched conceits, with similes. It's quite difficult poetry. It's very difficult poetry. And first we must know that why this and how this metaphysical word started in English literature. For the first time, John Dryden actually used this word metaphysical. He had said that John Donne, he had said these words about John Donne, that John Donne affects metaphysics. So this is how the first time this word was used, and the first person who was using this word was John Dryden. You are writing down these things now. Keep writing down. John Dryden, Drydon. He was the person who first used this word metaphysics for John Donne. And later on, important critic name was his name was Samuel Johnson. He's also called as Dr. Johnson. Write down his name, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson wrote down a book on the life histories of English poets. The name of that book was The Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. Write down the name of this book as well. The Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. And in this book he wrote down about 52 English poets. And when he was writing about Abraham Cowley at that time, write down this name as well, Abraham, Abraham and Cowly, Abraham Cowley. When he was talking about Abraham Cowley, at that time he used this term metaphysical poetry for the first time. John Dryden had used the word metaphysics, and this man Samuel Johnson used this phrase metaphysical poetry for the poets belonging to this school of thought, like John Donne, like Henry Vaughan, like Lovelace, like Crashaw. So he actually he was criticizing them. He didn't like metaphysical poets because of their comparison of two dissimilar things, because of their far-fetched conceits, and because of their difficult subject matter when they are talking about the soul, when they are talking about the spirit. But last it was used by T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is a very prominent name. He wrote an essay on metaphysical poets, T.S. Eliot, and in this essay he regarded them with much respect, with much honor, and from then metaphysical poets got recognition. Initially they were not so much recognized in English literature. When that major critic T.S. Eliot is a modern critic, he's a big name in English literature and in English literary criticism, T.S. Eliot. And some of you people might have gone through his poem as well in your intermediate course, The Hollow Man, that was written by T.S. Eliot. He's the same T.S. Eliot. So when he wrote an essay about metaphysical poets, and he regarded them, and at that time metaphysical poetry and metaphysical poets got recognition. As I'm saying that these poets use far-fetched conceits, and for example when you take John Donne, I'm just making you people understand that you just make your concept clear, that what are these far-fetched conceits. In Urdu, what is it called? Dur par ka istara, what it is called in Urdu. So how and in what way these far-fetched conceits were used by John Donne? For example, you might have gone through, I'm going to tell you these kind of things which you have already studied or which you have already gone through. On the previous day before yesterday, I was listening to one of your lectures in which your teacher was delivering you the lecture on Go and Catch a Falling Star. Go and catch a falling star, get with child a mandrake root. Now this is a conceit. Go and catch a falling star. It's quite difficult. It's rather impossible to go and catch a falling star. And get with child a mandrake root. Mandrake is a tree and its shape is like woman. Its shape is like a lady, like a girl. And John Donne says that go and bring a baby from the roots of that tree. That tree which looks like a woman, that tree might have given birth to a baby. So go and catch a baby, go and bring a baby right from the roots of that tree. So these are called far-fetched conceits, and these are called far-fetched metaphors, because you cannot understand. Okay, you will understand from Urdu. There is a verse of Mir Taqi Mir, महफिल में दूर बैठा रहा गुबारे मीर. Listen to it again. महफिल में दूर बैठा रहा गुबारे मीर, इश्क बिन ये अदब नहीं आता. This is actually conceit that Mir Taqi Mir has used. Mir Taqi Mir has also used far-fetched conceits and metaphors in his poetry. So Ghubar-e-Mir, the dust of Mir, kept sitting respectfully in the gathering where his beloved was sitting. What does it mean by Ghubar-e-Mir, the dust of Mir? Apparently, it's not making any sense. That what does it mean that Ghubar-e-Mir kept on sitting respectfully in that gathering? What does it actually mean? The poet actually means that he could not attain his love, and his beloved was not kind to Mir. His beloved was not fair and true to Mir, and Mir got upset, Mir got ill, Mir got sick, and then Mir died. And when he died, he was buried in the grave, and after a while his body was consumed. And when his body was consumed, his body had become sand with sand, his body had become dust with dust, and then wind blew, and when wind blew, it took the dust with it, and it brought that dust of Mir in the gathering where his beloved was sitting, and even that dust of Mir was sitting respectfully in that gathering. महफिल में दूर बैठा रहा गुबार मीर. And this cannot happen without love. He says that ishq bin ye adab nahi aata. So it is actually the conceit, far-fetched conceit, that apparently you cannot understand it. Go and catch a falling star, get with child a mandrake root. And the similes, the metaphors that he uses, those metaphors and those similes are quite confusing. He compares the love, he compares two lovers with a compass. You know that compass has got two needles, so their love is compared like the needles of that compass, who cannot meet anywhere and cannot meet anytime. You know the needles of the clock, they meet the needle of seconds, the needle of hours, and the needle of minutes. They meet with each other, they embrace each other in the course of some minutes, in the course of some hours, in the course of some seconds. They keep on meeting with one another, but the needles of the compass cannot meet each other. That's why he compares the love of two lovers with the compass. And there are famous lines which also tell about the conceits and the metaphors and the similes that are used by John Donne in his poetry. His famous lines: all kings and all their favorites, all glories of honors, beauties, wits, the sun itself makes the time as they pass, is elder here now when it was, when thou and I first one another saw, all other things to their destruction draw. Only our love hath no decay. This no tomorrow hath, nor yesterday. Running it never runs from us away. It keeps its first, last, and everlasting day. So this is John Donne. Here ends the metaphysical school of thought, and now we are going to discuss the last but not least poet of Puritan age, the age of Milton. So, who will be the last poet but not least? Can you people guess? Yes, he is none other than John Milton, on whom this entire age has been named. John Milton was born in 1608 and he died in 1674. He is also, as far as his art is concerned, as far as his technique is concerned, he is said to be the last Elizabethan. And he regarded Shakespeare, he regarded Edmund Spenser. He had great regard for the poets and for the writers of Elizabethan period, Elizabethan age. But interesting to note is that he didn't follow them. He had his own way, he had his own style, and a grand style, and the lofty style that is called as a style of Milton. And let me tell you one thing very important, that John Milton is the most striking writer, the most prominent writer of English literature of all times outside the drama, excluding drama. If you include drama, then Shakespeare happens to be the most prominent writer of English literature. So if you are excluding drama, then Milton is the most prominent, the greatest ever writer of English literature. So he was also a religious man, religious person. As far as his family life, or as far as his personal life is concerned, he was a very hardworking student. He studied Latin. He was quite learned in classics, and he used to study late at night when he was a school-going boy. That's why this late studying at nights affected his eyesight as well. And he had become blind in 1654. And let me tell you that the most striking work that he has written in English literature, he has written when he was blind. His he married 3 times. His first wife left him. His second wife died during childbirth. She was delivering a baby to Mr. John Milton, and she died, and during that childbirth, and he then married for the 3rd time. He was he protested against Charles I, and he was a staunch Puritan, and he is also called the child of Puritanism. He is also called the champion of Puritanism, the most striking, the most prominent writer of that age. When he was at school, he was an inconfident student. He was an inconfident and a shy sort of boy. Even some of his fellows called him the Lady of Christ. Lady of Christ, he was called so. So as far as his professional career is concerned, he himself was fighting in civil war against Charles I. As I was saying, that he was against Charles I, and Charles I was against Puritanism. So he was against Charles I, and he was fighting in civil war. He himself was fighting, and when he saw that physically he was incapable of fighting on war front, he came back and he became Latin secretary to Cromwell. And when Commonwealth got its place in England, and Cromwell became the head, and at that time it was 1649 when Charles was beheaded, and Charles II came into power in 1660, and we'll study in next age. Next age is called Restoration period, because Charles II was restored to the throne in England and in 1660. So 1649 was the year when Charles I was beheaded and he was hanged till death. So as far as his art is concerned, as far as the literature that he has produced, John Milton, we are talking about John Milton, that is marvelous, that is outstanding. William Wordsworth, you have heard his name. He says about John Milton that thy soul was like a star that dwelt apart. Thy soul was like a star that dwelt apart. So this is important line which a great writer, a great poet of Romantic age, William Wordsworth, spoke about John Milton. And his prominent work for which he is well known is Paradise Lost. So if you are a student of history of English literature, and if you are a student of English literature even, and even if you don't know that what is Paradise Lost, you are a pitiable object. You are a pitiable thing if you don't know about Paradise Lost. What is Paradise Lost? Paradise Lost is written about man's disobedience and his coming on the earth, and about fallen angels, about Satan, and about Satan's war with God. And John Milton says that the purpose of writing this poem, this epic, was to justify the ways of God to man. Justify the ways of God to man. How God justifies his actions to the men. This is what the purpose of writing this epic was there. And this was written in 10 books initially when it was published in 1657. 1667 when it was published, it was written in 10 books, and when it was republished in 1674, I think that when it was republished, yes, it was republished in 1674, and when it was republished in 12 books. Saturn, fall of the Saturn, fall of the angels, and then Adam's coming on the earth. This is actually the story that this entire epic reveals. Saturn fights with God. Saturn, he has presented Saturn as hero in this epic, in this Paradise Lost. He has presented Saturn as hero. Saturn assembles his soldiers, and who are those soldiers? The fallen angels, the angels whom God had thrown into the hell. So Saturn was also the part of those angels. So he gathers them and he becomes the lord of them. He becomes the master of them, and he gathers them to fight a war, to fight a victorious and just war against God. His famous lines, the speeches that Saturn makes in front of the fallen angels, the speeches that he makes in front of those soldiers, those angels who are with him to fight a war against God, those speeches are worth $1 million. Those speeches are quite inspirational. The way he inspires them, the way the way he assembles them, the way he manages them to fight that war against God. He says, what is there if the field is lost? What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will. And the unconquerable will